right. Thank you all for joining us on this very special lecture. My name is Dana Al-Kurd. I'm the researcher at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies and an assistant professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. And it is my great honor to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. David Lake is Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of California, San Diego. He has published widely in international relations theory and international political economy. He's the leading scholar on questions of hierarchy in international relations and has over 75 scholarly articles and chapters. Dr. Lake's most recent books pertaining to our theme are The State Builder's Dilemma on the Limits of Foreign Intervention, published in 2016, as well as Hierarchy in International Relations, published in 2009. He's also served as president of the American Political Science Association in 2016-2017. So Dr. Lake will be presenting on Indirect Rule, the making of U.S. international hierarchy. And he has let me know that it can definitely be an interactive process. If people have questions, please feel free to use the raise hand function and I will call on you. And, if you have any kind of pressing questions as he explains a couple of things. And then kind of the big picture ideas we can leave for the Q&A at the end. And hopefully it's going to be a very exciting discussion. Dr. Lake, as I said, I will give you a 5-minute heads up before 45 minutes. And then if you'd like to take more time, we definitely have the option for that as well. So without further ado, I will pass it on over to Dr. David Lake.
Thank you. Good morning. And welcome. I'm delighted to be here. Good morning from California. Afternoon to wherever you might be, evening in Doha or whatever time zone you're located in. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with you today. Now, the theme of the winter school, as I understand it, is the state in flux. You're going to hear many different perspectives on this theme over the next week as looking at the list of speakers. So what I want to do today is focus on indirect rule as a mechanism underlying international hierarchy. And the question is, so if the United States creates rules for others, as I will argue it does, how does it induce and enforce compliance with those rules internationally? As sort of background, there's far more compliance by others and less coercion by the United States than a focus on power alone, as international relations scholars typically focus on it, might expect. So the argument I want to make is that the nature of the state is partly endogenous. The U.S. rules indirectly through local allies, and this has important consequences not only for U.S. policy and international outcomes, but also for states themselves as states. Certainly for this audience and more broadly, indirect rule is a familiar concept, certainly not unique to the United States. Anyone who's studied the history of European imperialism knows well that indirect rule is ubiquitous. But at least in my little corner of the scholarly discipline of international politics, it's often assumed that indirect rule has been rendered obsolete by decolonization. I'm going to argue that it's still with us and applies more broadly than we sometimes believe. But before jumping into developing these ideas and themes, let me try and make clear from the beginning that I'm neither defending nor apologizing for U.S. policy and indirect rule. The ambition here that I have is to try and explain how U.S. rule functions, how it plays itself out on the international stage. Now, I've often get some pushback from critics of U.S. policy, and want to make clear that many of these views I actually share quite deeply. But in seeking to understand U.S. motivations and actions and the reactions of other states, I'm not defending the actions of either the United States or its collaborating parties within its subordinate states. Understanding how indirect rule comes about and the alternatives to indirect rule, I think, is critical. And this is where I want to try and focus the remarks today. I'm happy to sort of debate some of the policy and normative implications later, but I think that follows from an understanding of the actual mechanisms of international rule. So with that as prolegomena, let's start with a couple of anecdotes, if you will. Two seemingly disparate examples that at least sort of used to frame the issues, but doing so in very simple terms. These are both historical examples in which there are very deep complexities, but I'm going to glide over those here, at least at the beginning. So in the first case, I want to sort of introduce you to and get you thinking about conservative Adolfo Diaz in Nicaragua comes to power in a US-backed revolt in 1911. In exchange for new loans, he offers Nicaragua to the United States as a protectorate, offers to sign over the country to the United States as a protectorate. This is opposed by the Liberal Party within Nicaragua. Some mass demonstrations breaks out, and the United States invades in 1912 to support Diaz and to keep him in office. The United States troops withdraw in 1925, and the political system unravels almost immediately. The United States invades again in 1926, returns Diaz to power, and in doing so provokes the Sandinista rebellion, which is then put down in 1932-34 by Anastasio Somoza, who becomes the dictator of Nicaragua from there on out. So this is one case of indirect rule with a particular set of outcomes I want to be able to sort of think about as we move forward through the analysis. But there's a second case to contrast it with. Konrad Adenauer is elected as the first chancellor of West Germany in 1949. He's a Christian Democrat, quite conservative, not overly associated with the Nazi Party during the war, kept a sort of an arm's length relationship with the other conservatives in Germany. As he begins to lead Germany into the West, into various European institutions, and it's made clear that he wants to remilitarize and join Western security institutions. The United States gets solidly behind him in the 1951 elections, publicly endorsing him, saying he is the future of Germany, and supporting him against Kurt Schumacher and the Social Democratic Party. Leads Germany until 1963, rules democratically with majority support, but is one of the closest US allies. Right? So we have two seemingly different cases here, but they reflect a very similar underlying logic. And this is the logic I want to try and develop today, in which the United States tips the political scales in its favor and supports leaders and parties that will adopt the policies it prefers in its subordinate countries. This argument is, I'm trying to develop it in a new book. The book provides very detailed analytical narratives of the Caribbean, Central America region from the late 19th century through the Good Neighbor Policy in 1932, Europe in the immediate post-war decades, and the Middle East from about 1990 on through the present. Today, I want to focus in on the theoretical intuition and the Caribbean and European cases. I'm frankly still in the middle of researching and writing on the Middle East case, so I'm especially interested in your reactions and your thoughts and suggestions on how to proceed here. But I expect you'll see parallels to the region you all know better than I do at this point. So I'm very much looking forward to your questions, comments, and suggestions here. Before jumping into the two regions, though, let me step back a bit and talk about what I mean by hierarchy and what this looks like at the international level. This is the subject of a 2009 book that I wrote and that Dana mentioned, Hierarchy in International Relations. Just to sort of put these ideas on the table very briefly, I want to sort of say a little bit about what hierarchy means and how it plays out at the relations between states. Okay, so scholars of international relations, of which I count myself and write and speak to, we often assume that the international system is anarchic, by which we mean that there's no authority higher than the nation state. Right? All this means that there's simply no single global authority. But based upon this almost truism, scholars have then sort of extended the argument to say, well, that all relations between states are anarchic. And that's actually a fallacy of composition. Just because the system is anarchic doesn't mean that all relations between states are based upon anarchy without any aspects or elements of authority and hierarchy within them. So as we have opened up the topic of hierarchy, there's two ways of thinking about it. One is, and I owe this distinction to Aisha Zarakol in her book on hierarchies, plural, in international relations. There's a broad definition, which is really based upon status inequalities or any ranked ordering, right? Any hierarchical ordering, stepped ordering of relationships. And there's a narrow definition, which focuses in more on authority relationships and rule. Dan Nexon, who I think you're going to hear from later in the week or early next week, will undoubtedly develop the broad notions of hierarchy. This is where his work focuses. Today, I'm going to focus more on this narrow definition of authority relationships, where it's a measure of authority between any two states. Right? So the hierarchy book that I did is based upon three key analytic steps, right? Three analytic moves, if you will, that allow us to, or I hope they allow me, and I hope allow you to begin thinking about authority at the international level. The first key analytic step is to introduce a relational conception of authority. Authority is a central concept in political science. It's one of these words that we refer to all the time, but it's still an essentially contested concept. There's a standard definition, which is the first bullet on the slide, that authority exists when one actor has the power to give orders, make decisions, enforce obedience by others. But within the discipline of political science, we tend to use a formal legal conception of authority that precludes, almost by definition, the possibility of hierarchy between states. Right? In this formal legal conception, it is lawful office that confers authority on any particular ruler. Right? That if the laws of an election or a leader's succession were followed, then that leader has authority by virtue of the law, right? Of a formal constitution or a set of legal processes by which that person or party came to hold the office that is defined legally as the authority within a particular country. So defined in this way, because there's no lawful authority above states to confer authority on any particular state, there can't be any authority, and thus the relationships are anarchic. Right. So the discipline of international relations is sort of taken up and inherited this very sort of formal legal conception of authority. And it's not a bad way to think about authority, particularly in relations within established political systems. But there's actually a key problem with it, which is that formal legal authority cannot explain its own origins. Right. Lawful office confers authority on an individual or onto some other unit, presupposes the existence of law, thus authority, right? Law and authority, there's sort of a chicken and egg problem here of what comes first, and we don't know how to solve that. By implication, authority has to come from someplace else. And in fact, must precede law in order to create law. Right. So authority can come from tradition, from religion, from charisma, all of the elements that Max Weber grounded it in. But we can also think of authority as coming from a bargain or contract, this relational conception I want to introduce between the ruler and ruled. It's a negotiated system that in fact binds ruler and rule together within a contract, if you will. It allows us to sort of move away from this narrow and, I will argue, rigid formal legal conception of authority. This then leads to the second key analytic move, which is to begin to think about sovereignty as a divisible relationship. Sovereignty is really nothing more than a statement about where political authority is located. And we know there's lots of deviations from the principle, but it's traditionally assumed that sovereignty is one indivisible and it's located or sited, rooted in the state. This has now been challenged by quite a few scholars writing international politics. And following some of these ideas, I'm going to assume that sovereignty is infinitely divisible. The way to think about this is to use the analogy of a federal system, like the United States or many other federal countries, right? There are certain authorities that are located in the federal government. There are certain authorities that are located in state governments, other authorities that are located in municipalities, right? That authority itself covers a whole variety of policy areas, and that these can be allocated at different levels of government, right? So if sovereignty is divisible, we can begin to think of it as sort of being chopped up in pieces and allocated differently within countries and between countries. Right? And so for international hierarchy, what I mean by this is that there's a range of authorities that are exerted by a dominant state over a subordinate state. Right? Some authority is allocated to a dominant state. Some authorities are still located, reserved to, held by a subordinate state, but hierarchy increases with the number of actions of the subordinate that the dominant state regulates. Right? Is there a question there, Dana, or just some background?
No, I think somebody accidentally turned on their microphone. Please do continue.
Yes, the wonders of Zoom. It allows us to meet virtually from very far distances, but we sometimes
you also see the backgrounds, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so if we can think of hierarchy here as this divisible sovereignty allocated across states, another major concept we sort of want to introduce here, and it's going to be a part of the story I want to tell today, is the concept of legitimacy, which is a recognition by the subordinates that the authority that's being exercised is rightful or legitimate, in a word. Right? Legitimacy transforms the fact of rule, the fact of authority, into the right to rule. Okay, has a moral or normative connotation, right? We recognize that the ruler is rightful based upon some justification. Right? There's variations in legitimacy in all societies. We can think of, in every society, there's at least some anarchists who deny any right to rule. And in extreme, whole societies can recognize that a particular ruler or leader is rightful in holding his or her position. Right? States vary in their degree of legitimacy. In liberal societies, the state has certain limited rights, but it's possible for the state to try and transgress those rights, which within society recognizes as being illegitimate actions. And in totalitarian systems, there's a much greater room. More rights are possibly regarded as legitimate. The same internationally. Right? You can have hierarchy that is illegitimate, is not accepted as rightful by the subordinate peoples, and there's other hierarchies that have at least some element of legitimacy. But again, this is going to vary with the proportion of the subordinate population that recognizes the ruler's right to rule. This is in fact a variable. It's part of the political process that I want to try and capture. Legitimacy comes from many places. Right? Again, Weber, we can begin with Weber and begin to think about the sources of legitimacy. I'm going to use a very minimalist conception here in which individuals are unlikely to regard any system of authority as legitimate that leaves them worse off than some feasible alternative. Right? And that's really all I'm going to require as we develop these notions a little bit further. Okay. Having argued and made these first two key analytic moves that authority is relational rather than legal, and that sovereignty is divisible and can be allocated to different parts, the third analytic move is simply to say there's at least two dimensions of authority that we find in international politics, and we can understand relationships varying along these two dimensions. Right? At one level, we can begin to think about states, relationships between states as being anarchic down here near the origin of these two dimensions, right? Under diplomacy or market exchange, what I mean here is states are conducting their relationships as equals. There's no authority relationship. They bargain, they negotiate, they adopt policies that they want, but they're doing so completely of their own volition without any expectation of enforcement of an authority relationship within them. At the other extreme, we can think of relations in which the dominant state completely exercises complete authority over both security relations and economic relations between those states. We have a term for this historically. It's going to be an empire. Right? But they can also vary independently of these dimensions. You move from diplomacy to an extreme historic relationship we call a protectorate, in which the subordinate cedes its diplomatic security relations to the dominant country. One example to think about this, is the one I always use, is Micronesia, which as part of its condition for becoming an independent state in 1986, wrote into its constitution that the United States would be completely responsible for its diplomatic representation around the world. It holds one ambassadorship at the United Nations, and the United States represents it for all other countries. Right? It has ceded its foreign policy. Okay. We can begin to think about relations varying along the economic dimension as well, from, again, purely anarchic relationships to dependencies, where the economic policy is completely absorbed by the dominant country. You can think of relations that are, at least in monetary relations, that are dollarized, right? Where the US dollar circulates as the sole currency in Panama, for instance. And then there's intermediate relations, particularly salient ones that are a sphere of influence, which is sort of a negative injunction. You don't have to cooperate with the United States, but you're not allowed to cooperate with anybody else. Right? It's a negative injunction in that case. We actually have diplomatic terms to characterize these relationships, which suggest that they're, at least historically, and I will argue in contemporary terms, are still real relationships that we can understand. And that vary across different dyads between dominant and subordinate countries. And these relationships have consequences. I'm not going to sort of belabor this here. I want to move on to indirect rule. But in the 2009 book, in the hierarchy book, it showed in a variety of ways in which states subordinate to the United States spend less on their own defense. The United States is more likely to join a crisis in which those subordinates are engaged, have become embroiled into a crisis. The United States is more likely to come to their assistance. States that are subordinate to the United States trade more overall, and they trade more with other subordinate states that are also subordinate to the United States. And that states that are subordinate to the United States are more likely to join ad hoc or formal US-led international coalitions. Right? So there's a variety of relationships and behaviors that follow from these conditions, from this condition of hierarchy and its variations in international politics. So that's the foundation. What I want to do now is begin to explore where we should expect to find hierarchy, and in turn, how it's actually implemented on the ground. Hierarchy emerges to solve a problem. Right? And the problem is when cooperation is beneficial for one or both sides. At least one side is going to be better off if they somehow pool their efforts. But defection from that cooperative agreement is going to be costly, particularly to the dominant state. What hierarchy does is it constrains the ability of the subordinate to act opportunistically against the interests of the dominant state, against the interests of the ruler. Right? The point of creating rules and issuing authority, exercising authority over a subordinate, is to control their behavior. Right? It's to limit their options and enforce compliance with the rules that are set by the dominant party. When would we expect this? Cooperation has two roots. One is sort of aggregating your efforts, such two countries forming an alliance to fight against the third. They're pooling their efforts and increasing their power from what they would otherwise individually have. Cooperation is also necessary when there's specialization and division of labor, such as through trade or even various forms of security cooperation. Defection is costly when there's some specific asset at risk. This comes from the literature on industrial organization. It's sometimes called the hold-up problem or the obsolescing bargain in the case of foreign direct investment. It's easiest to see in the case of foreign direct investment. Think about a case of mineral extraction, for instance. Once the investment is occurred, right? Once the foreign firm has come in and opened up an oil well or a mine or something like that, that asset is rooted to its very specific location. Right? The host government can then seek to expropriate the investment, alter the terms, tax the proceeds in a way that's more at a higher rate than was originally agreed upon. Once the investment occurs, it's fixed. It's stuck there in that position, and the bargaining leverage shifts to the host. In order for that investment to occur, the investor has to have some expectation that the agreement will be honored, right, according to its original terms. Right? Otherwise, it won't invest. For firms, this leads to vertical integration. For states, it leads to hierarchy. Right? Whether this is about a foreign direct investment or forward-based military installation, the problem is still that having made that investment, the dominant country needs to control the behavior of the subordinate such that it will not renege or defect from the agreement that was originally created. Right? So not all relationships are going to be hierarchic. There's no incentive unless there is some specific asset at risk. Specific assets can take many terms, many forms: plantation agriculture, resource extraction, as I mentioned, portfolio investment in infrastructure, forward deployed military bases, all have the same quality of being subject to a potential holdup problem that needs to be managed. And hierarchy is the way we do that. So then how is this hierarchy actually implemented? Like empires before it, the United States rules indirectly through local allied groups. Right? Critical to the way in which indirect rule happens, it's rules through groups whose policy preferences are more or less closely aligned with its own. Right? The local group, the allied group, as I'm going to refer to them, is not able to achieve its own preferred policies. And the group collaborates with the United States in exchange for political support. I'm going to say more about this. In turn, the United States offers that political support and additional side payments to induce further concessions by that allied group. Right? But by supporting this allied group, or collaborators in the old vernacular, right, it increases the power of that allied group within its own domestic political system. When the allied group is small, indirect rule will be autocratic, and hierarchy will be recognized as broadly illegitimate. Right? When the allied group is large, indirect rule can be compatible with democracy, hierarchy can be broadly legitimate, and the compliance almost appears voluntary. It's this last character which I think has led us to underestimate the degree of hierarchy in international politics. Right? That when indirect rule works broadly through a majority, it looks as if it's voluntary, freely adopted, and so on. But nonetheless, once we understand the mechanism of international rule, we can see, in fact, how this is still a form of hierarchy. And it's the European case that I'll talk about a little bit later here. Okay. So let me be a bit formal. Please don't get too worked up about a little bit of Greek here. I want to sort of focus on the intuition, but I'm a visual person. I think in terms of spatial models. So it's easier for me to explain and hopefully easier for you to grasp what I'm going with here if we sort of go through a very simple model. It's a heuristic here where I want to focus on the intuition. But let's assume for the moment that there's a single dimension of policy that's in dispute. There are three key actors to the story. One is the dominant state, which we're arbitrarily going to fix their ideal point, their preferred policy here at 1. We're going to normalize this on 0-1 continuum. Right? There's a group that I will call the opposition group. And it'll be clear why that label in a moment, which is here at the other extreme at 0. Its preferred policy would be quite distinct from that of the dominant state. And then there's an allied group that is closer to the dominant state, different from the opposition, and can vary anywhere along this continuum. This, in fact, one of the variables we want to think about is how closely aligned the allied state is, the allied group is, to the interests of the dominant country or to the opposition. Just as a technical bit here, the sigma, the degree of asset specificity, is a weight on the dominant country's policy preferences. If sigma is 0, the dominant state just doesn't care what happens, right? It's not going to engage in rule. It's not going to be involved in the politics. It will keep a hands-off attitude as as its specific assets in the subordinate country increase, it develops more intense policy preferences and will be willing to bear higher costs to bring about a policy that it prefers, which is here at 1 on this continuum. Right? This very simple conception generalizes to multiple dimensions, more than 2 domestic groups, and so on. This is just putting it in the very simplest, starkest terms here to try and communicate the intuition. Given these interests, then we can think about 3 outcomes of concern. Right? There's domestic rule, where the dominant country plays no role at all in setting policy. There's coercion, in which the dominant state uses war or the threat of war to coerce the subordinate into adopting its ideal policy. And then there's indirect rule, where it works with a collaborationist allied group to adopt policies that are more favorable to the dominant state. I'll say more about each of these outcomes in a moment, but just to sort of walk through the logic here, and again, in very simple terms, what we're imagining is that the dominant state makes an offer of some bundle of resources called gamma. It's going to cost. It's a governance cost. But it's offering a bundle of resources in exchange for a policy that is being offered by the leader of the subordinate country, right? Policy X. The dominant state can reject that offer and says the policy is not good enough. Right? And if it rejects that policy, it can do nothing, which then creates domestic rule. Right? The dominant state's not doing anything. It's offered, but it's not actually giving the bundle of resources because it's rejected the policy, and it does nothing in return. So you get a domestic outcome. The groups within the society set their own policy. Or it can say the offer is not good enough and we're going to fight a war and we're going to impose our will upon you. We're going to use force, we're going to defeat your military power, and we're going to insist that you adopt a policy that we want you to adopt. Or the dominant state could also replace the leader and I'm going to skip over this a little bit and come back to it in a few minutes. Right? But these are the sort of two alternative options, if you will, of doing nothing. The dominant state does nothing. Domestic parties play their selves out, or using force or the threat of force to coerce the subordinate into adopting the policy that the dominant state insists upon. Or we have indirect rule, right? Through collaboration. In this case, the dominant state pays the governance costs. The leader offers a policy that is acceptable to the dominant state. The dominant state accepts it, and we have this relationship of indirect rule. Let me walk through a little bit more of the politics of each of these options, and then say, focus our attention on this element of indirect rule. Domestic rule here can be thought of in very simple terms. It's a very simple conception of domestic politics between groups A and B. Right? Imagine that D is not even in the picture. The policy that's adopted domestically is defined by the power of the group, which is pi, and the competence of the leader, by which I'm really focusing here on the leader's ability to manage factional struggles within his or her group. Right? Can the leader overcome factional struggles in order to bring the power of the group to bear? Right? The greater the power of group A, the more competent the leader, the more the policy is going to be closer to the ideal point of the dominant group, of this allied group. Right? In here, then, the country is simply setting its policy according to domestic rights between the struggle between the opposing groups within that society. Characterizes many international relationships, including U.S.-British relations after 1945 is one example. Right? Britain was left pretty much on its own. The United States was not deeply involved in the politics of Britain. Britain adopted a policy and then negotiated with the United States on the basis of that policy. Large fractions of the world, the United States simply doesn't care enough to pursue a policy of indirect rule or coercion. Right? Domestic politics plays out according to its own design. In the case of coercion, it's equivalent to war or the threat of war, right? And the dominant state has to get a policy that is at least as beneficial to it as what it could expect to get in war. This is the bargaining theory of war. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's now sort of pretty standard in the literature on international relations. If the dominant state wins, the probability of victory, it gets to impose its policy, but it pays a cost of fighting the war. It may also lose, which is 1 minus P, right? 1 minus the probability of victory. In that case, the subordinate country adopts its domestic policy, but still the dominant state has to pay the cost of fighting. It's fighting in any event. And so this is X sub W is the dominant country's expected payoff from fighting a war. Right? The higher the probability of victory or the lower the cost of actually fighting, the more likely the dominant state is to use coercion to impose its will. Again, we can point to examples of this, invasions of Nicaragua. In the example of Diaz that I began with, as an example of coercion to impose its will, although in that case and others we can think about, the United States quickly reverts back to indirect rule, where I really want to focus our attention. I know I'm coming up on time, Dana.
So yeah, you're about to almost hit 45 minutes,
yeah.
But we have a little bit of leeway, so I will stop you at a little bit before an hour.
Okay, no worries. I hope, give an academic the floor, as you all know, and we'll talk forever. But I'll try and keep this as brief as possible.
No
okay.
problem.
But here's where I do want to take a couple of minutes and work through what I mean here by indirect rule and how it functions. Okay. If the dominant state doesn't like what domestic rule is going to produce, and war is costly or unlikely to be successful, it can turn to indirect rule. How I want you to think about this is in the following way, is that the dominant state then forms an alliance with this allied group A. Right? Two things are going on here, and they're equally important. The first is recall that X sub Q is the best that the allied group can do on its own, right? Given its power and given its the competence of the leader, this is the best it can get were it left strictly to its own domestic devices. Right? The dominant state now pays a governance cost. Which is a resource, it's a transfer of resources. This transfer of resources has two components. One is part of those resources allows the allied group to enact its preferred policy despite resistance by the opposition. Right? As policy moves closer and closer to Group A's ideal point, the opposition is going to become more and more resistant. It's losing. Right? It's less well off as policy increases in this direction. The allied group needs to suppress or buy off the opposition. Right? It can either repress it forcibly, coercively, or it can try and sort of bribe, give policy concessions on other dimensions, do a variety of things, but it needs to pull policy in this direction despite the resistance of the opposition. So part of what the dominant state is doing, part of those resources are going to, in essence, increase the power of the allied group, right? Either to repress or induce the opposition to concede. Right? So as policy is pulled in this direction, part of these resources are being used. I'm going to think about it as greater repression of the opposition, right? So that the allied group gets a policy that it wants. But having gotten these resources, the allied group really has no incentive to offer a policy that's more attractive than its ideal point, right? It's say, thank you very much, United States, for that bundle of resources. We're going to now impose the allied group's ideal point on the opposition. We're going to repress the opposition, but we're going to do what we would really, really, really like to do, which is the policy that is represented by the ideal point of this allied group. Right? In order to induce further concessions, the United States, the dominant country, needs to make additional resources contingent upon the adoption of a policy that is more favorable to the United States or to the dominant country. Right? So the second part of that resource bundle is contingent. You want to think about it as sort of annual reauthorizations of various benefits to the subordinate country that will allow it and induce that allied group to make even greater concessions. The larger the bundle of resources, the governance costs that the dominant state is paying, the more it can pull policy in its favored direction. Right? So this is how, if you want to think about it, that the dominant country is able to induce the subordinate country to adopt a policy that it finds more favorable. It needs to strengthen the power of the allied group and then make these contingent concessions which pull policy in its favor. And both parts of that are going to be essential. For reasons of time, let me skip over the replacing leader. That's not really all that essential. I want you to sort of think about the indirect rule. There's lots of implications that follow out from this. Most of them aren't particularly counterintuitive when we have very simple model like this with full information. But there's a couple of big propositions that I do want you to take away from this. Is that the smaller the governance costs, the more likely is indirect rule. If the dominant country can get a lot of bang for its buck, so to speak, is more likely to choose indirect rule. The higher the probability of victory and the lower the cost of fighting, the more likely is coercion, and especially the more aligned the preferences of the allied group and the dominant country, the more powerful the allied group is, the more competent the leader, the more likely is domestic rule, right? The dominant state takes a hands-off approach when domestic politics will produce the result that it otherwise wants. In the last couple of minutes here, let me very quickly then talk about the Caribbean case, Caribbean Central America case. Right? I want to start here with the interests of the actors. This is more complex. I'm going to go through this very quickly, but sort of sketch in broad terms, paint in very broad strokes the empirical argument here. But the United States enters the Caribbean 1880s into the 1890s. What it wants is a regional monopoly and economic expansion. Wants to push the Europeans out of its backyard. And as it does so, it begins to invest in highly specific assets, which are, of course, the Panama Canal, and then a whole variety of plantation and agriculture and mineral extraction, classic cases of these specific assets. So it's acquiring more specific assets, becoming more intense in its preferences over control of the region. The countries in Caribbean Central America themselves are highly divided. These are some of the most economically unequal societies in the world at the time, and highly divided along a particular line here where the landed elites, about 10% of the population plus or minus, are in the process of expanding commercial agriculture, privatizing communal land, and seizing control over cropland that's been previously held by tenant farmers. The masses pretty disorganized, spread out over the island. History of slavery, very disorganized, but nonetheless, they're focusing in on sort of local working conditions, land redistribution, and so on. We can walk through the alternatives. What would have happened under domestic rule here? This is a counterfactual, a hypothetical, right? These are countries that are have come out of a colonial experience with typically Spain or some of the other European countries, but most commonly Spain. So the landed elites have always been backed through a form of indirect rule with the colonial country. But nonetheless, we can begin to think about what would have happened here is that these elites were extremely vulnerable. It's a very small portion of the population, and imposing commercialization of agriculture onto a population that is resistant to that, and trying to exploit that population at the same time. They're living in fear of bottom-up revolution throughout this entire period. Left to their own devices, the landed elite would probably have slowed the rate of been forced to slow the rate of commercial agriculture, the transition. Probably would have won, right? Extremely powerful landed elites, but nonetheless would have had to most likely slowed down. Coercion turns out to be relatively expensive for the United States. We think of the United States as being the colossal of the North, but actually the Spanish-American War turned out to be a pretty expensive war, despite its reputation of being a splendid little war. Casualty rates are pretty high, and the United States draws the lesson that it's going to be very hard to govern the region directly. How does indirect rule get adopted here? The governance costs are reasonably low, right? U.S. backs the landed elites in exchange for policy concessions and the protection of U.S. investments. Guarantees the survival of these elite regimes, intervenes to suppress the opposition when necessary, and intervenes to replace truly incompetent leaders within the region. So this history of military interventions are largely in support of these elite-based regimes, occasionally to get rid of a leader who's incompetent or not following the rules the way they're supposed to. So this is the first part of that bundle of resources, is the protection of the landed elite regimes. The second part of the bundle of resources that's transferred to concessions made by the United States to induce greater cooperation is actually tariff concessions on tropical products, primarily sugar, which start being implemented in the 1890s on through into the post-World War I period. The result, what we get is compliance with US policies, autocratic rule by small elites, broad-based anti-Americanism. And in several cases, when the elites begin to, political stability is so intense that indirect rule doesn't seem to function, you get coercive attempts in the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Nicaragua, where US troops land and declare martial law for 8 years in each case. Think about how this plays out in Europe, though. The contrast with the Caribbean, Central America is pretty important. But it's still indirect rule, but very different consequences in this case. What does the United States want? It wants allies in the Cold War, wants economic liberalization. Europe itself, in the immediate post-war period, is divided between left and right. Conservatives largely share US interests. Think Konrad Adenauer as the opening anecdote. Right? Left parties prefer international neutrality in the Cold War and greater scope for domestic economic planning. Right, sort of slower rate of liberalization. Europe itself divided. Left is probably the dominant party. There's some variation across the various European states, but in France and Italy, for instance, the Communist Party is by far the largest electoral winner in the initial post-war elections. Once the United States becomes involved in Europe, both economically and especially militarily, once it adopts a forward defense posture, begins to deploy bases and troops in Europe, these become specific assets that are at risk of a left government coming to power and throwing the Americans out. Domestic rule is unacceptable to the United States. Coercion is very costly. So what do? The United States intervenes, if you will, in the domestic politics of the European societies in a form of indirect rule, begins to support centrist and especially center-right parties across the continent. This is often direct electoral intervention, bags of cash being given to the conservative parties in Italy and France to help them win the elections against the communists. Propaganda of various forms, buying and supporting publishing houses that are going to print pro-American newspapers. So the United States puts its finger on the scale, if you will, of the political balance within European societies. It also adopts a variety of policies. We typically refer to as the sort of the Pax Americana, if you will, but Marshall Plan aid and other forms of foreign aid, export-led growth, subsidized security are all more specific inducements to try and pull the policy of the conservative groups within Europe more in favor of the United States. And by 1951 or so, centrist or center-right parties dominate across the continent.
So, Dr. Lick, you have about 5 minutes.
I will. I'm just about finished. Okay. So as policy consolidates around this Pax Americana, hierarchy becomes invisible. Right. You build majority coalitions around these centrist and center-right parties, who then are freely elected, and cooperation appears almost as it's voluntary, despite some resistance by de Gaulle, which I'm happy to talk about. So let me leave this final slide up here. It's sort of trying to compare across the three cases. I think you can begin to place the Middle East, contemporary Middle East, into some of the framework that I've been trying to lay out here. The bottom line is as I'm deepening my knowledge of the region, it looks ever more like the Caribbean, Central America to me. not exactly, of course, but in broad terms. But I would really very much welcome your assessments, your insights, and any comments you might have. So with that, sorry for blathering on longer than I had hoped, but looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much. That was a very rich lecture, and it's given me a lot to think about. So I don't want to abuse my privilege as chair to ask you the first questions. So I'm going to open up the Q&A to anybody who might have some questions. But if you're not brave enough quickly, I might take advantage of the opportunity. So does anybody else have questions or comments or? I do not see everybody. Please use the raise hand function if you do have a question, because some of you have the video off, so I can't necessarily see who might want to talk. Okay, so maybe I'll start us off and get us all warmed up. So thank you again for the lecture, Dr. Lake. And the whole time you were talking, I was trying to kind of place the Middle East and trying to see, how these concepts might work. And I had a couple of, interjections or questions as well. And I'm sorry for kind of the free flow, but I was typing them out, as you spoke. So can you speak to us more a little bit about the types of cases? I know you had some examples at the end, but the types of cases which feature allied groups being large or small. Because the question in my mind was, are allied groups mostly large in Western contexts? So is it that certain regions lend themselves to certain types of relationship with the United States? Because when I'm thinking about the Middle East specifically, I really think that it could be kind of one of those places that is unique in its relationship to the United States, given both its high strategic value that has kind of outlived the Cold War context and the very low popularity. So that was kind of something that I was thinking about. And the second thing that came to mind was the choice for the dominant state between indirect rule and coercion. I'm sorry that I'm not an expert in spatial modeling and I don't use it in my work. So perhaps this is kind of covered by your spatial model. So feel free to let me know if that's the case. But are there instances where there's kind of combinations at the same time? So I'm thinking, for example, of Bahrain, where the Fifth Fleet is. There is an allied regime that is willing to repress. And in that sense, there is kind of an indirect rule relationship. But there's also coercion in the form of the US military base. And military weaponry and now also Israeli weaponry and Israeli surveillance that have now started to more free flow into Bahrain specifically and the region more fully. So I'm just wondering kind of what are your thoughts on those two interjections I had in mind?
Look, the very simple theoretical framework doesn't specify where the majority of the population sits relative to the ideal points of the two groups, right? The Allied group and the opposition. In the case of the Caribbean, Central America, the vast majority of the population would have clustered around that of the opposition. The Allied group, the landed elite, various merchant classes, the professional classes, and so on, as I said, probably about 10% of the population clustered around the ideal point of the Allied group. Right? So what you would have had is a very skewed distribution of the population within Central America and the Caribbean. Right? In that case, the United States, by backing the Allied group, is almost requiring a form of repressive and autocratic rule. Right? 10% of the population is not going to win an open election, free and fair elections, right? They will be outvoted by the vast majority of the population, which is sitting over at the far left of that diagram in the opposition. So the only way that the United States will get favorable policies there is to guarantee the survival of the landed elite against the opposition. Right? So that's a case where the distribution of the population is such a way that the allied group that is most favorable to the United States, most willing to sell its policies in a way in exchange for support from the United States is, as a small group, rules autocratically and generates a century of anti-Americanism from the average citizen in Central America and the Caribbean. Right? Now, the example of a large group is near the Allied group's policy preferences is Europe, which really sort of comes out of World War II. The far right is delegitimated, and you have the split between the left and the center right, not far right there, right? It is very much up for grabs in Europe in the post-war period, right? You could have seen a set of political coalitions coalescing around the left, or a set of majority undecided, what's the future of Europe, right? All of that, which could have been formed around the center right. And the United States sort of steps in and helps push politics towards the center right. And this sort of a majority coalesces around sort of integration, European institutions, NATO, defense policy, so on and so forth, right? That's easier done in this case because of shared interests, both in opposition to the Soviet Union and potentially shared interests of sort of political philosophy, political institutions, histories of democracy, and so on. I won't say there's something inherent in the West that links them together, but it's probably easier because of some shared political conceptions to build a majority coalition around policies favorable to the United States within Europe than in some other regions. Okay? But in all these cases, you're going to have some variance within the regions, right? Talking about Central America and the Caribbean. Mexico is a little different from Cuba, which is different from Puerto Rico, and so on, right? There's some variations there. I think the Middle East, at least as I'm trying to think about it today, is often governed by relatively small elites with concentrated political and economic power, right? And are facing various forms of opposition that could be quite large. And part of the deal, you pointed to Bahrain, right? It's delegating its security policy in part to the United States by the stationing of massive US bases there, giving up its independence, if you will, and ability to conduct an independent and autonomous foreign and military policy. Right? If you have major US fleet sitting in your port and tens of thousands of US troops, you can't do whatever you want in terms of a foreign policy. Right? So there's a trade here of support for the regime in exchange for some loss of autonomy in Bahrain's ability to set an independent foreign and military policy. Right? You can think about the extent of the opposition within the country that would prefer a different policy and a different regime in power. Right? But part of the deal is, the United States is providing aid, military aid in particular, that strengthens the hand of the regime against the opposition. Right? You're going to find variation across the Middle East today about how large the opposition might be and how crucial U.S. support is for these elite-based regimes. But there's at least a resonance, if you will, with the, as as I think about it, there's a resonance with the Central American cases from the early 20th century. Right? Mark Twain's said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. There's a bit of rhyming going on, I think, there. Right? But of course, there's variation across the region.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the regional comparison between Latin America and the Middle East is always interesting to kind of contemplate. Though some have argued that the Middle East is there was this argument about strategic choke points. For example, the number of strategic choke points in the Middle East is quite a bit higher than strategic choke points in any other region. The state of Israel is quite a strategic asset of the United States, and so it perhaps distorts even to a greater level. I'm not really sure how necessarily it works. And given some of what you've just mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like from the dominant state's viewpoint, public opinion is only so much as considered as how much it impacts the regimes or the domestic allies, correct?
Right. Well, two points. The strategic choke points are simply theoretically, we can think about those as being geographically specific assets. The value of thinking about specific assets is that it unifies the way we think about these things in the security literature, which are sort of strategic locations or choke points or whatever, right? And the way we think about these things in the political economy literature, which are sort of mineral extraction and plantation agriculture and those and infrastructure and portfolio investment. It's the same idea, right? Is that once you decide that you need to control this choke point or strategic location, that becomes a highly specific asset, whether it's the Fulda Gap in Germany in post-war period or various straits throughout the Persian Gulf or Southeast Asia, or wherever. It's the same idea, right? It's an asset that is of value to the United States that it needs to control. So yes, the U.S. has, this is why the period after 1990 is somewhat more interesting. It has expanded the number of specific assets it holds in the region, and its policy preferences have become more intense over time. Right? It cares more about what goes on as it has invested more, particularly militarily, in the region. But the second part of your question, I may have lost the thread here a little bit, but
so I was just asking about particularly like in the dominant state's kind of calculations when it chooses to accept what's being offered by this allied regime or not. How much does public opinion kind of factor into that, aside from how much the public poses a threat to the state? Because that seems to, like, for me, that seems to me like quite a short-term calculation. And one of the criticisms that people here in the region often make about the United States, particularly, is that, like if you think more long-term, you should probably ally with these publics that are more natural allies to kind of the democratic systems, that they would be more inclined to being a part of this fold than
yeah, look, that's the $64 trillion question here, right? The public opinion matters in the short run, right? It's going to affect the bundle of resources, the governance cost to the dominant country. the more unpopular the United States is, right? What that unpopularity comes from both supporting a regime that is opposed to what popular opinion might want the regime itself to be doing in the region, and also because it's adopting policies that are more favorable to the United States. Right? So as indirect rule works, and policies pulled increasingly towards the United States, the opposition gets more and more resistant. Right? Popular, you want to say, call it public opinion, but it could also be revolution, terrorism, various forms of resistance. Right? That just means that in order to sustain indirect rule, the cost of the United States goes up. The bundle of resources that are necessary to repress an increasingly unhappy population increases. Right? So either the governance cost goes up for any given policy, or you get less favorable policies for any given cost that you're willing to pay. Right? So as that opposition increases, indirect rule becomes more difficult, ever more difficult. Right? At some point, you say, "Screw it! It's not worth it." Right? We're going to pick up our marbles and go home, and we'll let domestic politics play out the way that they'll play out. Right? I think the real uncertainty about the Middle East, and you all probably can speak to this better than I can, is exactly what would the majority of the population embrace. Democracy is a low priority for the United States. We all know that. Will it embrace military and economic policies that are favorable to the United States? Or would it not embrace those military and economic policies that are favorable? At the moment, right, the elite-based regimes have been willing to adopt policies that the United States is generally willing to condone in exchange for the bargain, right, that they've made. Would the majority of the population make a similar bargain, or even a bargain that's more favorable in terms of its military and security economic alignments? I don't know the answer to that question.
And I think it's also time specific. I think that there might have been a period after the Arab Spring where that balance had shifted in terms of what the public may have been willing to offer. And I think that following kind of the collapse of the Arab Spring and following, some civil wars and things like this, that has also shifted in people's calculations. And would you say that I should probably check the raise hand function. If there's any questions, please feel free to shout. But I just have one last interjection. Okay, Bushra, I will give it to you in 1 minute. I apologize. I just find this fascinating. So the last thing I wanted to say is, would you say that picking up your marbles and going home, that is less of an option for the United States here specifically than in other places? Like we saw, for example, when there were anti-military basing protests in certain countries around the world during the Cold War, if there was alternatives, the U.S. would back off. They wouldn't support their allies under all circumstances. Whereas I think in the Middle East, would you say that there is no way for the U.S. to extract itself as long as like the state of Israel is present or its oil interests are at risk? There's really no alternative to picking up their marbles and going home? I don't know if that's the correct idiom.
Well, if I were to speak not as a theorist, but as an opinion writer, right, I would say the United States should pick up its marbles and go home. Right, the implications of what the theory suggests, and as I think about what U.S. interests are in the Middle East, we've expanded our role, and that role itself becomes self-fulfilling. Right, as you build out more military bases and root yourself more deeply into the region, you end up then having to defend those military bases. And why do we have military bases? It's largely because of the investments in the region, which frankly, we ought to be disinvesting from for environmental reasons, at least in my view, right? So if I were designing US foreign policy, I would say we should unravel our role and step back and let domestic politics play out. right? That we're in now some sense chasing our tail of defending our bases because we have bases there, right? And not really sort of stepping back and reflecting on what is it that the United States really wants to happen in the region.
And it is quite a difficult question. Since, like you said, the U.S. is so invested, it's like the vacuum it leaves also has global ramifications. But yeah,
certainly, because
yeah,
if you stop indirect rule and step back, right, regimes in the region that have been supported by the United States come under challenge, right? So, you know, there's a very difficult problem here. Bursa, please.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to dominate. Bushra, please continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lake, for this amazing lecture. I have questions in my mind for future studies, actually. You're talking about in here about the US indirect rule in other regions, but is it possible to apply this theory to other countries? Like, can we consider China's relations with in Africa right now can be considered from this perspective, or is it also applicable to other smaller relations within regions?
Sure. Despite the use of proper nouns in much of this, it's a general theory of indirect rule. I've written a couple of papers applying this exactly to the case of China, the Belt and Road Initiative. My friends in China get very anxious when I describe it this way, but it's the early stages of US investment in the Caribbean Basin. Right. China today, through Belt and Road, looks to me like the United States around 1900. As it's making these large infrastructure investments, extending loans that will never be paid back, and developing mineral extraction in Africa, and in turn, making political alliances with segments of those countries, it looks to me like an analogous case, if you will. So I see China going down very much the same road that the United States has gone down, with what I anticipate will be some of the same consequences of getting the policies that they want, but at the expense of alienating significant portions of the population. Right? And it can certainly also apply within regions. This is not a great power limited to great powers only. No, D and Group A and Group B are really quite generic, and I think they should apply elsewhere. Many of the ideas here, I would say, they came to theoretically, but they were also informed by a deep reading of the literature on European imperialism. And I think the model applies equally there as well. So I hope it's general.
Thank you so much.
Let me unmute myself here. Any other final questions? Again, there is the option underneath to raise your hand, because if I hadn't been looking at all the pictures, I wouldn't have seen Bushra. Any other final comments? Let's see, here are the attendees as well. Well, okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Lake, for this truly enriching lecture. It's given us a lot to think about. And, I appreciate you giving me the time to ask my questions over and over again. And if there are no other, pressing comments, I think that we can probably adjourn this lecture. So thanks again, everybody, for your participation and for your attendance. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
And thank you. Thank you all.
Take care.